see you here today.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm really excited to be here.
So you used to live on the East Coast, and you've recently moved to Austin, Texas. It might be helpful to know that the conversation today will be about economics and politics broadly understood, perhaps in the age of COVID-19. So Texas is an early forerunner here, a
Yes,
particular
absolutely.
approach to opening up. What have you seen there in Texas? What have you seen there in Austin so far?
It's been really interesting. I personally have operated out of probably an abundance of caution. I was pretty early to self quarantine myself and stop going into an office even before any of it was legally mandated here. And I was at the four. I had tried to get some masks and things like that at kind of the very beginning of things, but it's been really interesting to see. It seemed like for several weeks or maybe even a month here in probably the April timeframe,
Mm.
people were taking it very seriously. If you walked out onto the street, everyone was wearing masks. People were, it was notice, obviously all restaurants and bars and things like that were closed completely, and there was just noticeably less general activity. I live in the downtown part of Austin, very near one of the major outdoor like nature attractions, which is a trail that
Mm.
runs around a portion of the Colorado River, and everyone on the trail would be wearing masks, and it was very sparsely populated, and
Mm.
people weren't in the river. And then probably I would say maybe at the beginning of May, right when the governor announced that Texas was going to be reopening, it was really like in the snap of a finger. It felt like, from who I observed, it seemed like a complete inversion. Like
Yeah.
when you would walk out, probably 90+% of people were not wearing masks. I went for a couple walks last weekend, and restaurants are reopened and people are sitting there, not social distancing. There are a lot of the boating and outdoor attractions are now like packed with people and tourists again.
Mm. Wow.
And yeah, it's interesting to see. It definitely, there is almost, I guess, maybe a palpable like quarantine fatigue that people here felt, and a lot of people are certainly trying to get back to normal as possible, and kind of throwing caution to the wind. And it'll be interesting this weekend because Texas is obviously one of the foremost states that's reopening. Austin is generally an attraction for tourists, and now since it's one of the only tourist destinations in the country that's even open, we expect a large influx of travelers
Mm.
this weekend. And Austin relaxed the mandatory, or Texas generally, I guess, relaxed the mandatory self-quarantine for people traveling in from out of state via airfare or via plane. I think in a bunch of other states, if you come in, you have to self-quarantine for 14 days, and Austin doesn't have that. So we're expecting a lot of inbound traffic from all over the place, and it's going to be an interesting natural experiment to be run, for sure. But I will be playing it cautiously, I would say.
Yeah, you've been providing a fairly objective assessment, but there's a little bit of cheekiness there. I'll just say that what strikes me as very interesting about this is that I've been leading a philosophical life, ostensibly so, for about a decade. And one of the things you learn from leading a philosophical life is that there's a difference between doxa, the Greek word for the opinions of ordinary people, and truth. So if you start to be committed to truth, then necessarily you start to diverge, or almost necessarily start to diverge from the opinions and views of ordinary people. And so I've just been staying put because I don't see any fundamental difference between the conditions 3 or 4 weeks ago and the conditions now. So wisdom enjoins me to be prudent in this case, not in all cases. So my wife and I are still hanging out in the house
Yeah.
and into the foreseeable future. So it puzzles me when I begin to hear that nothing ostensibly has changed on the ground except for the fact that the economies are opening up and beaches are open, parks are open, public places are open, and as you said, people are throwing caution to the wind. So what do you make of that puzzle?
I think I think first and foremost, people um, are generally fatigued of sheltering in place. I think that for many people, for most people probably, it was an extremely um, uh, it was extremely different from their general conditions, both from the amount of personal freedom they had, the amount of social interaction they had. I think it was a really, and I think it took an enormous mental and emotional toll on people, to say nothing of the actual, economic or health or physical health
Mm.
tolls. So I think that there was a large amount of fatigue of this default state that we had gone into, which was sheltering in place. And I think as well that people, there is a large, at least for many people that I talk to, there is a large degree of maybe confusion as to um, what what the actual science says about how contagious things are and what are the best practices to stay safe and how it can spread and who's really at risk. There just seems to be, at best, the conventional wisdom, and I suppose it depends on your sources, but maybe perhaps like mainstream media sources, the conventional wisdom seems to change, every few weeks. And so, we were first told that masks don't do anything, and then we've been
Oh,
told
the
that
CDC. Oh, the
now
CDC.
now everyone should be wearing a mask, and we've been told that, there's been I suppose obviously differing opinions as to where this could have possibly emanated from, and how actually contagious it is, how actually fatal it is, how what your immunity becomes after you've been infected with it, what the expected death toll is. I mean, all of these, what you might think would be seemingly like objective or scientifically verifiable elements of this entire situation have the conventional wisdom has gyrated wildly, generally
Yes.
speaking. And I think people are just kind of confused and I guess a bit fed up with the default state of things. And particularly, I think particularly for young-ish people, there's a young-ish, relatively healthy people, there's a thought that the risk is pretty low of adverse health matters befalling you, and people are more concerned about themselves than they are about spreading the disease. And so while people may pay lip service to the elderly population, I think at the end of the day, most people, if they believe that that they themselves are at a very, very low risk of something physically deleterious befalling them, they're willing to roll the dice, especially when they've been pent up for 6 weeks plus at this point.
So you've given, maybe turn the conversation here in a moment, but you've given two different reasons. And the first one is that people have been pent up, right? And they have fatigue. I would say something slightly different. I think that's true. But I given my given my penchant for philosophy, I would say that it's a revelation of Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism. People don't know what they're living for, so they'll default. They'll default. Right? There are no higher reasons for living, so they'll default to the ones that are available to them. Right. So cultivating the physical body in some way, or taking part in conversations, or hooking up, or whatever. These are fairly common responses available in modern secular culture. And maybe we'll come back to secularism and nihilism later on. But to me, when it's the case that someone starts to feel pent up, it's not clear what the person's going outside for in some higher sense.
Mm-hmm.
I actually agree with, surprisingly enough, I actually agree with President Trump, who wants to open up places of worship, calling them essential.
Mm-hmm.
It's one point on which I actually agree with him. As the second point, the point about people's confusion, I would call that skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
And the really strange thing about skepticism is that while the skepticism is true, it doesn't entail the actions taken. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You think skepticism would actually entail a certain prudence. Well, wait a minute, I don't know what's going on here. And in virtue of not knowing what's going on, I'm going to take a very measured approach. So we can maybe ponder that later. But let me move to a very interesting fact. The fact is that 38 or so Americans have recently filed for unemployment. I wonder just what you make of this fact that in a very short period of time we have, I don't know what the numbers are recently, but 20% or more unemployment in this country.
Yeah, it's very disconcerting to me, that fact. I think as far as the impact of it, I think as a nation, where the analogy or the metaphor I might use is that did you ever watch the old Wile E. Coyote cartoons? And he
Yeah, yeah. Those are my time. Yeah.
so Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff
Yeah.
and then is like suspended in midair for a moment, and
Yes.
only after a moment does he start falling. And I think
it's once he realizes that he's suspended. That's
right,
that's
right,
the cool part of the
right. So I think we're at this being suspended in midair, and that the actual impact of our action of the situation has barely started to fit in. The fall has not actually started, and you see that in the sense that things like the stock market performance is completely decoupled from what many Americans on the ground are feeling. And there has been some amounts of aid that has been given by the federal government and the state governments to kind of tide folks over. But none of those are substitutes for economic activity in the sense of providing subsistence to people, let alone maybe some of the meaning or whatnot that they might derive from work. So I think that it's pretty stunning to me that fact has seemingly been so glossed over in many respects, as far as the zeitgeist opinion of how we're doing. Certainly.
What do you mean it's been glossed over? I think maybe you're referring to the blue church or to maybe mainstream media, or are you referring to other people?
I think, I guess, and I'm drawing both from like the meta narrative, so maybe mainstream media and popular media sources, but also just in my anecdotal conversations with people about, that's the other interesting thing too, is that every couple, there's, even in my anecdotal conversations, people seem to veer pretty wildly from optimism, or from optimism, life's gonna get back to normal very soon, to pessimism, many people are gonna die, this is gonna be the new normal for years. And I think a lot of the maybe recent optimism that I've seen around the fatality rate, and maybe promising elements about hospitals not being overwhelmed and a vaccine having come, don't account for this really like nuclear detonation economically that has happened to the country, and the disruption of 1 in every 5 workers, I think, something like that, of having been totally displaced from a job, coupled with the fact that it's not clear that once we get this virus under control, that the job is going to be there for them to come back to. It's just these destruction comes a lot more quickly than rebuilding does, in many things, including jobs. I mean, part of the main issue here is uncertainty. So if you are, let's say you have an entrepreneurial spirit, and you want, even in this time, you want to start a coffee shop or a pizza parlor or something that involves physical interaction of people, you're going to wait to do that until there's some certainty. Uncertainty is a 4-letter word in the business community, and so, and
which 4-letter word? I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So it's not like the baristas that have been laid off are going to be able to go back to work once states have reopened. A state can mandate people staying at home, but it can't mandate everyone going back out and participating in the economy.
Mm-hmm. So, and I'm in the state of New Mexico, which tends to be a fairly poor state, apart from a couple of major cities here. And I think Governor Lujan has actually been more measured in her approach. But that said, we just started to reopen fairly recently, and there are pretty stringent limits on the number of people that can go into a shop and the manner in which they can conduct themselves in that shop. And you have to just wonder whether some of these shops or we haven't opened up gyms yet, but they're coming in the early June. How can they possibly survive the situation? A, because of uncertainty. B, because of lack of volume. And these, so far as I can tell, they're places that have thrived on volume. Mm-hmm. Or coffee shops. I can't conceive of the possibility. They're trying to push product pretty quickly. So you're right. I think it's fair to say that we do have Wile E. Coyote in a suspended midair, who is yet to quite fathom his actual position. By the way, that's kind of a tragedy, right? It's a moment right from Aristotle's Poetics. So the greatest moment of tragedy, Aristotle said, was exactly when the hero recognizes the tragic flaw at the very same moment that he falls. So I suspect that's behind that little scene. So it hasn't happened yet. Let's come a little bit more closely. I think we're gonna dig in more to some of the less orthodox issues surrounding our economic climate soon enough, because I'd like to get a little bit past some of the kind of mainstream media takes on what's going on. But first, do you have any sense of what industries have been most impacted, economically speaking?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that that from what I've read and what I've observed, that industries that rely on people being physically co-located in a specific physical location are the ones that are most affected. So things like restaurants, although restaurants have a lot of them have pivoted in a pretty innovative way and are offering curbside service and contactless delivery and things like that. So the actual the delivery mechanism, instead of a waiter bringing it to your table, but rather an Uber Eats or DoorDash person bringing it to your door, they've been able to adapt a bit. Obviously, it's not as lucrative and rents haven't changed. So, but putting that to the side, so restaurants, bars, I think gyms for certain, salons and hairstyle places, amusement parks, cruises, hotels, airlines, rental car. So really physical retail, travel and leisure, transportation. Generally, people aren't as mobile. I think those are probably the main ones. Real estate is kind of a derivative of those, because
Mhm.
as restaurants go bankrupt, they no longer take up the lease. So I think we'll see and as people lose their jobs, they have to downsize apartments and things like that. But I think that is really a second order effect that hasn't
Yeah.
totally been, that takes like months and years to really work its way through the economy, because those leases and those mortgages are multi-year
Yes.
arrangements, whereas some of the stuff that the actual tenants owe, or the immediate solvency of a business can get upside down in weeks or months. There's some interesting charts that I've seen that show like the average number of months that a business could go with zero revenue, and no
I'm still a little
business
bit
has
shocked. I'm still a bit shocked by that, I must say. Maybe it's because I'm my father's son, but no one's talking about actually having savings for hard times. So there's a little bit of something that seems to be left out when you see all these businesses collapsing forthwith. You think, well, where was it tucking, right? Where was it tucking the money away for hard times? At least for having
Yeah.
a couple months. I'm not sure what happened there, but
Well,
the
when you see,
The Washington Post and New York Times are certainly not providing any reports to that effect.
well, when the average American can't provide for a $400 emergency, it's not that surprising that the average American business can't survive more than a month or two without revenue.
I guess I would have thought that those are disanalogous in some way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it is, and I don't know. So I come from the startup technology world, and we sell software, and we sell software to businesses, and so the amount of time it takes to sell software to a big business is very can vary widely. And so for us, for software startups, going, a calculation of how long you could go with zero revenue is actually a fairly common calculation to make, and it's how we fund our business. We raise money from investors with the assumption that we're not going to have any revenue for a matter of months or years. So
You have a
I guess
burn rate. Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
So there are maybe small pockets of the economy that have planned their finances differently, but yeah, as a small business owner, if the vast majority of your wealth is tied up in the equity of the business, and you may not have access, you may not have good, you may not have the business the business only makes sense or is only able to be viable if you can take most of your revenue and pay the rent for that month, or something like that. It's Black Friday in the retail business, in the retail industry, is the Thursday after Thanksgiving, and that's when retailers become profitable, and that's 11 months into the year. So I guess it's illuminating just how much on the razor's edge many businesses are living.
Yes.
Now, I think you could say, though, and there's a lot of interesting ethical considerations here, but is there anything inherently wrong with that? Like, is there? And I don't know.
With businesses, you mean businesses failing during hard times? Is that what you mean, or?
Yeah, or maybe said better, like, is it unreasonable for a business to plan? Like, should a business have to have a rainy day fund? And is it the type of thing where it's an unpredictable natural disaster that a global pandemic would shut down, the entire global economy? And so, when a business has certain extreme tail risk like that, it's usually insurable, like a fire or a hurricane, or something like that. Is a pandemic one of these things, one of these crazy exogenous effects or exogenous events that we can't reasonably expect every company to prepare for? Because if you had to have if you had to be able to weather the once in 100-year flood every day, it might be a lot tougher to, or a lot less likely that a business would even get started to begin with. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. So some people have been thinking that it was interesting is that the UBI debate, which used to be, I think, on the fringe, has now come closer to the center. Spain, for example, I think is going to give $500 or 500 euros, I can't remember which, to either to all citizens. I think it might be to the hardest hit citizens. I'm not sure to what degree it's going to help them weather the storm based on their cost of living. Americans basically received a stipend recently to the tune of approximately $1,200 per person, and then different iterations thereof. And there has been talk in the HEROES Act of doing a second round stimulus. In fact, Mark Cuban recently came out on Twitter arguing that the first stimulus was basically ineffective, and he has his own more enterprising approach. But
fellow Texan Mark
That's
Cuban.
right. That's right. Exactly. Do you think that UBI is going to be making more headlines as we proceed? Do you think there's a case for you? Let me recast that question. Is there really a case for UBI given the current pandemic, and perhaps given those who are concerned about job loss due to certain deep learning AI?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very certainly very topical, and something that I've thought a decent bit about. I think that so the interesting component of the 40 million people losing their job that we didn't talk about is kind of like the political ramifications or potential civil unrest that could end up resulting from that, because that block of people, which is something, I don't know, 10 can't do math, maybe 10% or so of the American population, probably even more of the voting bloc, who have been like deeply affected by this. And so
some sociologists may call setting aside some of the high rollers who happen to be involved in the face-to-face, let's call most of them the precariat class. Yeah, sociologists are wont to call them. So we have a precariat class. We have Marxism is waiting in the wings here. So yes, civil unrest is a definite possibility. And I think that's why a lot of governors saw fit to open up the economy just when they did. I think they had to adjudicate between a series of very, very difficult risks. And they probably saw that if we don't open up soon, the potential civil unrest could be worse than other things we see.
Yeah. I mean, these governments have not been in an enviable position. They don't have any overwhelmingly obvious and an unfraught path that they can take. There's downside, and there's going to be second guessing no matter what they do. But I think from a UBI perspective, certainly with this many people out of work and hurting immediately, the political will is going to be there for it in a way that it never has been before. And we've seen governments, a government never, as particularly the US government, never lets a good crisis go to waste. And, we saw in the Great Depression, massive revamping of the social contract between the government and its citizens. That has lasted to this day. I mean, what maybe was characterized as like temporary or emergency actions, in the wake of a crisis, still has lasted to today. And the Patriot Act, which was nominally a similar thing, just got reauthorized again 20 years later. And so I think that governments certainly Um, I mean, maybe
Your cheeky
even
reply is a little bit Naomi Klein-ish, except with Naomi Klein shock dropped him, but it's more of an objective take. It just happens to be the case that when there is a state of emergency or state of exception, as one philosopher calls it, uh, purportedly provisional measures are taken of an extreme nature, and those become the new common sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, I think UBI will. I think there will absolutely be another round of
Mm-hmm.
benefits that go hopefully directly to people. And but but it's a bit like some of the bailouts that we've seen in the commercial sector, in that
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't think that you could do that forever, or at least it's just not. I don't know that it's a sustainable substitute for actual, in this case, actual employment.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that less, maybe less from a pure sustenance perspective,
Mm-hmm.
um, because clearly with modern monetary theory and other interesting new economic paradigms, we maybe don't look at printing money as the boogeyman that we once did. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just, I don't know that the idea that that a large swath of the of healthy adults would and could opt out of the workforce. It's just it would be a radical
Mm.
social
Let's
change.
let's dig in. Let's dig in here. So
Okay.
we have um, we have Andrew Yang arguing, I think erroneously, as I've come to see it, that more and more truck drivers and so forth will be unemployed as a consequence of deep learning AI. As I've read more into the matter, I don't think, based on what I understand, there's a book called Rebooting AI, in which it's argued that this particular form of deep learning AI is just not sufficient, they argue, to actually get around to fully automated
Mm,
driverless vehicles. So I'm not an AI expert, but I'm just, if that's true, then we're not going to have yet the replacement of truck drivers. So that was kind of part of the platform he was running on.
yeah.
Recently, however, he had a conversation with Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, etc. And Dorsey kind of made headlines when he suggested that coders and the like could be actually are more likely candidates for being put out of work
Mm,
owing to advances in AI. So we certainly are hearing more and more of the arguments that either blue collar or certain white collar workers or both will be affected by AI. And thus something is in order, it said. Um, and it's also seemed to be said on this front that we can't retrain people quickly enough to pivot into something else that would allow them to have a livelihood.
hmm
So you've heard those arguments about UBI being on the table, but what do you make of the fact that uh, you said it would be a massive shift if it were the case that 40 million young Americans would be out of the workforce?
I mean, they're just, and this better than probably anyone, but
Yeah.
the modern, life as a modern adult American, just seemingly work and the idea of working just has a massive gravitational pull. I mean, so much of life
You're
revolves
taking this to be
around.
really an anthropological point, right? This is like a rite of passage. We don't know what. Am I understanding you correctly? You're not making an economic point at this particular moment. It
Right.
seems like you're saying this is what people have gotten so accustomed to as they get to a certain point in their life that this would be a fundamental existential upheaval.
That to me is what I think the most unsolvable problem of it is. I think, I think monetarily, particularly with, large wealth inequality, I think, I think getting sustenance to people in such a way that they could that they could live if they wanted to opt out of employment, that to me, while maybe challenging, to me it just pales in comparison to what you, as you said, the anthropological notion of having a useless class of people. And I guess
that's a reference to, listeners might not know, it's a reference to Yuval Harari. He wrote about in a Guardian piece and also in his book Homo Deus, and he hypothesizes, it might be more like a science fiction conjecture, that we could arrive at a point in history where the masses are no longer needed in a way that they once were. We've already seen this happening in manufacturing. Even as jobs have moved to China, it still doesn't require as many people to be involved in factories that it once did, owing to automation and robotics. So so we could hypothetically speaking see a so-called useless class emerge.
Yeah, and that, from an idea of thinking about civil unrest in that regard, I suppose once once you open the spigot of UBI and you have some type of direct transfer from people, once you make the redistribution so plain and clear, it just kind of worries me about, and we've seen this in the past, government benefits and programs are often a one-way ratchet. And so Social Security started, almost 100 years ago, has for a very, very long time been, the electrified third rail of politics that no one can touch, even as it, plunges into basically insolvency. So it's very difficult once you start giving people stuff to take it away at some point. And so if UBI is to be a one-way ratchet, as I suspect it to be, once you start, difficult to stop, how $1,200 a month becomes $1,500 a month, becomes $2,000 a month. I wonder what a fair, and I guess fair in this case is a highly loaded term, but what like a fair or politically sustainable way for it to evolve would be, because.
But what is your critique here, or what is your qualm? Because it doesn't seem to be that you're taking the view, a kind of standard conservative view coming out of, say, a Manhattan Institute would be that we're losing something fundamentally important and very American, which would be the Protestant work ethic and the responsibilities that accrue therefrom. So far, you haven't said that yet. So what is this? What is the center of your concern if UBI were to be passed?
I suppose a couple things. One, I think I think it could harm maybe what might be called like American dynamism or something like that, from a sense of a highly redistributive and progressive regime that is and let's be clear, I'm assuming for this case, that some meaningful amount of the funding of UBI comes from taxation of high earners and wealthy people. And so under that assumption, those people, and
I guess a more vigorous taxing of the big five Apple,
Yeah.
Amazon, so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while I think that 100 years ago,
Mm.
taxing the wealthy people and taxing the most powerful industries was a sword that the government could wield with impunity because they had no alternative. I suppose that, you know, in the market for global geopolitical dominance, who's to say that other countries won't make it extremely attractive for either the current wealthy people or big companies, or the future wealthy people or big companies to go there? You know, the American
Oh, I see.
dream
Yeah.
has been great and wonderful, but why couldn't it be the Singaporean dream in the future? And so
So
that's
this
a bit
could
of a
usher in for you an age of decadence. And I'm using Nietzschean language, but it sounds like you're saying, look, this could be a decadent age. If this happens, we lose the dynamism that comes from Silicon Valley as companies move elsewhere for tax reasons and for other benefits. And because people are not energetically, let's say, engaged in things, right? But maybe they're dissipating the energies through video game play, as Harari hypothesized. We might see the kind of dissolution of spiritedness, what Plato once called thumos, which is kind of this courageous, what is he called? Courageous, animated, almost like animal spirits. Some call it. That seems to be the center of your critique. I mean, setting aside feasibility for a moment.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, that if we're assuming that we're funding this UBI primarily from either wealthy people, wealthy companies, what have you, if you scare them all off to go relocate and move somewhere else, then what do you do? I mean, then does it become quite? Is the possibility of a failed state of like a Venezuela or something like that possible? And what's the time frame? And you know, that to have that point of view, I suppose you have to really not give feasibility. You have to reject a lot of the evidence that we've seen so far that printing money is something that the government can do without any adverse effects to the status of the U.S. dollar as something that a lot of people around the world value and want to hold, because we've seen, you know, the UBI experiments that have been run so far, and you know, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but you know, the $1,200 and a lot of the state unemployment benefits is UBI in a sense. It's, you know, giving people money. So that has not been funded by taxing the rich or by taxing corporations. It's been funded by the government effectively creating money out of thin air and handing it out to people. And so, you know, if you don't want to target the wealthy people, if you want to keep them incentivized to stay here, but and turn on the money printer to fund it, that presents a whole nother host of potential problems and issues as well.
During an email exchange in the run-up to this conversation today, you suggested that one of the stories that hasn't really been talked about, and indeed for quite some time, has been inequalities between, let's say, the boomer generation and Gen X, Gen Y, iGen, and so on. What's interesting is that you're making one argument here so far, at least not on behalf of or not against UBI, but you're sounding cautionary notes about UBI so far. Even though it's one way that people have tried to suggest that the divide between the haves and have-nots could somehow be not equalized, but there could be some kind of assuaging of the livelihood problems for those who are worse off. So someone would think that someone would think, based on what you've said so far, perhaps that, well, he's not that interested in various forms of equality, but quite the contrary. You have expressed your concerns about this. So what is the focal point of your concern when it comes to generational as well as income inequality?
Yeah, I do think the generational one, I enjoy stories that don't, in my opinion, get their fair moment in the sunlight, get their fair due. And I think that the generational conflict that this particular crisis brings to light is one that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and I think it's one that has been somewhat swept under the rug in battles of left versus right, or battles of rich versus poor, wealthy versus versus poor. The battle of, or the divide line between old versus young is, in this country, is one that's really interesting to me. I think from a financial point of view, if you look, talking about Social Security again, we have people, the baby boomers are now beginning to retire, and those baby boomers were paid into, over the course of their life, Social Security, and so now feel like they're entitled, and they believe themselves to be entitled to it. They paid into pension plans that the states are responsible for delivering them benefits of, and they in a real financial sense paid their dues, and feel entitled to that kind of financial award. Once they've done, they fulfilled their part of the social contract. Now they don't want the government to dine and ditch on them, if you will. So that made sense, or that kind of makes sense in a world where population is always increasing, and that there will be if there were a generation bigger than the baby boomers to pay into funding the baby boomers, and so on and so forth, if it became like a true pyramid, then it would be sustainable forever. But the financial reality is that it's just not. Pensions have been mismanaged. Returns have not met the expectations that that people had advertised, and effectively there's the younger generation that is now currently paying into a lot of those financial programs can see the writing on the wall, that the baby boomers are going to get theirs, but probably, but even if they do, the programs are we know about investment when we see one, and these programs are underwater. And I think many people of Gen X and millennial age don't expect to ever see a dime of Social Security in their when they retire. And so that's one axis across which we are funding, you could argue we're funding the boomers retirement and graceful aging, while knowing that we likely will never see or receive the same. So we're the first generation that's truly paying into a system where it's pretty obvious and probable, at least in my opinion, that we'll never get a payout of it. And then what this crisis has illustrated.
But that's just one. Please, I want to hear more. But that's just one axis. We're not talking about student loan debt. We're not talking about the fact that income hasn't really matched cost of living in many places, such as New York or the Bay Area or Seattle. Nor are we talking about the rise of housing costs and so on. So I just want to make that plain. This is just you were just giving us one illustration.
And the housing stuff and the stock market stuff is all very real. Like the boomers have made have seen their wealth increase an exorbitant amount based on the increase in value of those types of assets, and in part due to the financial crisis, in part to other things, younger generations just have not enjoyed surfing that wave as much as the boomers have. Now, what the pandemic brings into such interesting relief is a generational battle again, which is that effectively, and let's take the most let's presume kind of the most let's for purposes of my assumptions about the effects of the disease, let's say that it truly is relatively innocuous and mild in most young healthy people, and that it truly is seriously dangerous and kills some single digit percentage of people over 70 or something like that. And so if that is indeed the case, then the entire economy and really life as we know it has been ordered to shut down so that we can save the oldest and most vulnerable among us. And there's certainly very good.
I'm enjoying
Ethical,
this. I'm enjoying this kind of utilitarian line of thought here,
yeah,
or anti-utilitarian line of thought, perhaps you might say.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, look, there are certainly very good or potentially very good ethical arguments to do that, but similarly, destroying the ability for people to conduct a livelihood or put food on the table for their families, or just otherwise go out and live life however they want. These restrictions on personal liberty, like there's a real cost and potentially a real human cost to that as well. And so it seems like we don't have perfect information, but let's assume that my assumptions, what I said about the disease are true, then we're implicitly making the choice of valuing, the protecting the boomers again over, over what the Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z, et cetera is. And look, it's frankly a very uncomfortable decision or choice to make.
Yeah, I can't quite make out whether you're saying one of two things, and I know it's nice as we're kind of getting into the juicy part of the conversation. To be short, I can't tell whether you're saying one of two things. One, there's an argument to be made about power here, and it turns out for a whole host of reasons that boomers are very powerful, a very powerful class of people, and we haven't admitted as much, nor have we pointed this out. So one is there's a power struggle here of various kinds. The other one, though, particularly with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, might be a little bit, might be what you're saying, namely that it's not that you're claiming that there's a power struggle. You're claiming that, for example, we care so much about the perdurance or longevity of the physical body that we already have this a priori commitment to saving human life, regardless of how old it is. But yes, certainly too when it is old. So it just happened to be the case that this a priori metaphysical assumption is playing itself out in a public health arena in ways that are also, once again, beneficial for older people and not beneficial, and in fact, deleterious for younger people. So I'm not really quite sure which one you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I would say to the first point, it's less about power and more. I mean, maybe it is implicitly about power, but it's more of this pandemic is yet another item on the checklist of grievances that the Gen X and Millennial and Gen Z could have of ways that the boomers are kind of screwing them. We've
But isn't that power difference?
Yeah,
what am I missing here?
Yeah, I suppose
I'm not trying to claim that you're a closet Marxist. You're a closet Foucauldian. I'm just I'm just saying I'm not sure what the shorthand word for that is.
Yeah,
you have a rentier class. You have a rentier class.
I think it's the part that that I think though is the toughest pill to swallow is that I don't know. I feel like many of my generation feel duped. It's not just that we've been screwed, it's that we've been lied to about it along the way. We've been told and promised that if we do X, Y, and Z, then A, B, and C will happen. And it's just becoming abundantly clear time after time to talk about student loans or, getting a job, investing in the stock market, paying into Social Security, sheltering in place, any of these things. It's just like yet another thing where we're told one thing, and it turns out that that the benefits that we're told will befall us for paying our dues and for pitching in are bogus, or at least turn out not to be true. And I think it's that duplicity and that feeling of having the wool pulled over our eyes that really, for me at least, incites a lot of resentment potentially.
I don't know if you. We'll get around to Buddhism at some point. At least here we are in the political economic arena. I don't know if you've seen that Eric Weinstein recently came up with an argument about the Great Nap. And he suggested that from 1945 to this pandemic in 2020, we've been in what he calls a great nap. And he puts like you, he's putting his finger on, he puts it even more strongly, frankly. You've been tepid in this regard, on a kind of inept elite leadership class that is playing itself out, not just among boomers who are retired and such, but also most explicitly in positions of power. These be people in universities, of course.
Yeah.
You've seen these charts as well. We see that university professors are definitely staying. They're staying a long time. He's also referring to the fact that Trump and Biden are both over 70, and we could have also pointed to Sanders.
Yeah.
And so the suggestion is that they're actually not fit to lead, and that they fell asleep at the wheel, and that they're really quite incompetent. I mean, I think he's wording it much more strongly than you, but it seems as though there's a convergence in terms of what you're both saying.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly sympathize with a lot of that thought process. And yeah, I think, he's maybe, where I'm maybe talking purely along generational lines, he's talking about how it seems like how our institutions and experts have failed us, which I completely, I completely agree with. I mean, looking back to at least like the definitive events of my life will probably have been, in no particular order, how global health experts screwed up the pandemic, how financial experts screwed up the economy, and how geopolitical and security experts screwed up all kinds of involvement in the Middle East. I mean, those are really the defining events of my life. So I totally think that that it's a fair criticism to level. I do think though that that specific, like the battle against experts, I do think has gotten a decent amount of play in the mainstream narratives and zeitgeist, and I actually think that is a big reason. You talk about the rise of populism globally, and I think that those both contributed hugely to the rise of Trump and Sanders on both sides. Is like the railing against the conventional neoliberal wisdom that guided us for from whatever the 80s until now, where the world was where we had kind of like divergent Americas of who was doing well and life was getting better for, and who it wasn't.
Yeah. So I'm still trying to understand what they come back to your kind of your understanding here of boomers versus millennials. What exactly is it that so far you've just claimed that millennials and other generations, of which I'm a part, have missed out on certain goods in life. We've been sold a false bill of goods. What is it in terms of the good life, do you think, that this seems to be in duress? Or what is it that we really, for example, I'm a philosopher, and I feel fortunate because I don't really feel as though I've missed out on anything important.
Mm.
I live a fairly unorthodox life. We meditate a lot. I'm able to speak with a lot of people through my philosophy practice who are involved in positions of power, who are in technology, and who are also in who are also involved in finance and the arts and so on. I feel as though I've had a pretty lovely life, and maybe I didn't have the expectations others had. I don't know why this is so, because I grew up in my parents were initially working class, and then they followed the trajectory into the upper middle class by the time they retired. And so I'm not really quite sure why it was the case, but I've never felt as though I haven't received what was my due.
Mm.
But I agree with you that there are a number of people across the political spectrum who are making these grievances felt. But what do you think is the heart of what they feel as though they're missing in terms of the good life, in terms of the life they would have liked to have led?
So for one, I think that that a big part of, and you know, I'll cite Yuval Harari again, in that stories are extremely powerful. Shared myths are extremely powerful, and
Mm-hmm.
the shared myth of America is a very, very powerful one, obviously. And one of the elements of the shared myth of America is that each generation does better than the generation before it. You come here as an immigrant, the next generation is working class, the next generation is middle class, et cetera. And I think for the you know, for millennials, at least from studies that I've read, you know, we are the first generation that is not expected to do better than their parents across a whole bunch of different socioeconomic indicators. And so that, you know, doing better and you know, having a better lot in life than your parents, whether a reasonable expectation or not, is in my opinion something that's woven into the story of the American dream. And it seems more and more like we are not going to participate in that. Moving on to something less maybe material, is I think looking at like things like family formation and birth rate and willingness or desire to have children and procreate. And I think, you know, it's a theme I think you've researched and touched on a bit, but the fact that due to advances in science and changes in culture, people are just putting off having children for later and later in life, postponing that you know, big decision until later in life. Or, you know, something that I've anecdotally noticed is like the rise of people, and maybe this is just the social media, you know, looking like funhouse mirror that I look at, but it seems like people are in a very real way substituting getting pets for having children. You know, you see this meme of people calling themselves dog moms and dog dads, and they are of the age and in a specific cohabitation situation where you might think they would otherwise be having kids, and they're not. So I think that, you know, the element of meaning and fulfillment that comes from, you know, having a family and procreating, and like, you know, part of that comes from science, but part of it comes from some of the cultural changes where it's expected that, you know, both members of the household work, and if you're climbing the corporate ladder, it's tough to be a mom potentially, or a parent. And so there are very real obstacles that if you want to pursue a lot of the things that there's cultural pressure on, that maybe some of the elements that would be that you'd be able to enjoy of the good life, like having kids and a big family, are no longer on the table. You know, I think similarly, owning a home is a big one that was widely viewed as the American dream, certainly across the political spectrum. If you look at,
there was a State of the Union address by George W. Bush, the second one, in
Yeah.
which he talks about, it's the famous ownership society speech. Right? So
Hmm.
he was trying to cast that American dream in somewhat new form. So
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government entities that are responsible in part for crashing the economy in 2008, but moreover, in part responsible for making sure that home ownership is accessible to everyone. I mean, those have survived many different political administrations. And so, our generation, due to the 2008 economic crisis, student debt, this pandemic, it's looking less and less like we're going to be able to approach the levels of home ownership of previous generations.
So I want to push back here because I like where you're going with this, but I think it's good. I think it's good to provide a kind of twist. So as I interpret it, your wariness about UBI is that, and I'm going to use Nietzschean terms, it could issue in an age of decadence. But it seems to me that there's another kind of decadence that could be issued forth here. And the decadence has to do with an American dream that's been spoken of for quite some time and it's gotten a little bit tired sounding, I would argue, but now is less fulfillable by people who are younger. Now, we can either turn their energy or our energy toward perpetrators, if you will, or, and this is obviously where my countercultural credentials come in, we can begin to say, wait a minute. This could be what I call an existential opening. Things are not playing out in terms of what Venkatesh Rao calls life scripts of the kind we're accustomed to, right? We can either try to double down on them, or we can feel ressentiment, as Nietzsche would say, a great sense of resentment, which is not unwarranted in certain respects. Let's even grant as much. Or we can begin to be a little bit enterprising, so to speak, and say, wait a minute, what if it's the case that this particular story is itself not that wonderful in the first place? I happen to own a home now in a mid-sized city in New Mexico, but it's not as though I think, oh, this is the life. And I never thought of owning a home as being the life. It's okay. I like that I have a contemplation room that used to be an office.
Yeah.
I mean, there are things I like about it, but it's not. Oh, finally, I've arrived. I'm still wearing a t-shirt. I'm not wearing a tux here.
Yeah.
and to be sure, it is harder to have kids today, but it's not impossible. But we still have to ask ourselves, in what sense is the family itself undergoing fundamental transformations? You and I have talked a little bit, I think, about David Brooks's recent argument about the transformation of family over the course of the 20th century. And I think we're actually involved in fundamental changes to the structure of family life. I've seen that in my life too. And, as regards career, I've been very skeptical of what I call total work. I think careerism is one particular instantiation of it. So it seems to me that it behooves us to come to a certain kind of consciousness whereby we begin to look around and say, wait a minute, let's just assess the life of boomers for a moment. How great is it? How great was it? I would say not that great. That's what I did when I left the academic life. I looked and I saw that the professors who were sitting there and the ones who were ostensibly chaired professors didn't seem to be all that happy, if I may say that. But I thought, wait a minute, how can it be the case that those who are the most successful, accomplished, are not necessarily the happiest ones? It led me to leave academia for that reason and for other reasons. But had I just stayed in academia, oh man, I would have been in trouble. I'm 41 years old right now. I'd probably still be adjuncting, or I'd be what the guild structure would call journeyman, right? Be kind of bumping around doing adjunct positions, probably never moving into the ranks of the assistant, associate, full professor sorts. I'd be making a couple $1,000s a semester, let's say. It's pretty abysmal. And I can continue to say, look, I don't see how, objectively speaking, I'm any less intelligent than the gentleman who's a full professor. I could keep saying that, or I could be enterprising and say, I wonder if this is really that great of a life. Is it possible to lead a different life entirely? So that's my pushback. What do you think? In other words, this could actually be the beginning. Let me even be a little bit a little more feverish about it. This could be the beginning of a renaissance. People actually just were to wake up a bit. Wait a minute. The stuff that we've cared about is not available to us in how we thought it was going to be. Is it actually possible to begin to assess? So this is the examine life. Is it possible to begin to examine our life, singularly and collectively, to see what now is possible?
I
see from your expression that this is going to be a measured answer. There's going to be on the other hand coming.
Well, I mean, I certainly relish and accept that invitation. I suppose that I'm skeptical that the majority of people either have the capacity or the desire to do it. I don't know, deprogramming yourself is a difficult, and waking up is a difficult and uncomfortable experience. And I guess I would worry that many people are more comfortable taking the blue pill than the red pill.
Okay, so I was just talking to someone on a podcast the other day. It's a resident burnout podcast. So I'll just push a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So he was saying something to that effect, that these sorts of things are hard. And from a Buddhist point of view, I don't agree. We think that the easiest road is the easiest road. Continue on this path, say millennials, but it's actually the hardest road, because it's already been fraught with suffering, as is evidenced by what you've said so far. People are resentful. In time, they'll become bitter if it continues along this path. All right, they'll say this is unjust, and so forth. And without actually coming to political consciousness. So that's another route we could have talked about, but coming to a genuine form of political consciousness. So it's just resentment, stewing, bitterness, perhaps, as the road continues. So the purportedly easy route is actually the hardest route. And the purportedly hard route, wait a minute, no more of this, I've had enough, is actually the easiest route.